The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, as a woman in her late 30s walked down a quiet road. She was dressed casually, wearing a simple jacket and jeans, her hands tucked into her pockets. The road was mostly empty, with only the occasional car passing by. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes focused on the horizon, unaware of what was about to happen. In the distance, the low rumble of motorcycle engines began to grow louder. A group of bikers, 5 in total, appeared around the corner. They were dressed in leather jackets, their bikes gleaming under the fading sunlight. They rode in formation, their presence commanding attention. As they approached the woman, one of them revved his engine loudly, the sound echoing through the quiet street. The woman glanced over her shoulder, noticing the bikers for the first time. She didn't seem alarmed, just mildly curious. She continued walking, her pace steady, as if she hadn't noticed them at all. The bikers, however, had other plans. They slowed down, riding alongside her, their engines growling like wild animals. One of them, the leader of the group, pulled up beside her, his face hidden behind a dark helmet. "Hey, lady," he called out, his voice muffled but loud enough to be heard over the noise of the engines. "You lost or something?" The woman didn't respond immediately. She kept walking, her eyes forward, as if she hadn't heard him. The biker revved his engine again, this time even louder, trying to get a reaction out of her. The other bikers laughed, their voices carrying a mix of amusement and mischief. They were clearly trying to intimidate her, to see if they could scare her into reacting. But the woman remained calm. She finally turned her head, looking directly at the biker who had spoken. Her expression was neutral, almost bored, as if she had seen this kind of behavior 100 times before. "No," she said simply, her voice steady. "I'm not lost." The biker seemed taken aback by her response. He had expected her to be frightened, to maybe even run away. But here she was, standing her ground, completely unfazed. He exchanged a quick glance with his friends, who were now watching the interaction with interest. They had clearly underestimated her. "You're not scared of us?" another biker asked, his tone half mocking, half curious. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a young man with a cocky grin. He seemed confident, sure that he could rattle her with just a few words. The woman shrugged. "Should I be?" she asked, her tone light, almost playful. "You're just a bunch of guys on bikes. What's there to be scared of?" The bikers were silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. They had expected her to be intimidated, to maybe even beg them to leave her alone. But instead, she was challenging them, turning the tables in a way they hadn't anticipated. The leader of the group, the one who had first spoken to her, narrowed his eyes behind his helmet. He wasn't used to being brushed off so easily. "You've got some nerve," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Most people would be running by now." The woman smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to say she had seen it all before. "I'm not most people," she replied. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of steel in her words, a quiet strength that made the bikers pause. The leader revved his engine again, but this time it felt more like a show of frustration than an attempt to intimidate. He was clearly thrown off by her confidence, unsure of how to proceed. The other bikers were watching him, waiting for his next move. They were used to being the ones in control, the ones who could make people nervous with just a look. But this woman was different. She wasn't playing by their rules. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "if you're trying to scare me, you're going to have to do better than that." Her tone was almost teasing now, as if she was enjoying the situation. The bikers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering. They had come here looking for a reaction, but they hadn't expected this. The leader finally took off his helmet, revealing a man in his early 30s with a rugged face and a scowl. He looked at the woman, his eyes narrowing as if trying to figure her out. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity now rather than menace. The woman didn't answer right away. She looked at him, her gaze steady, as if she was weighing her options. Finally, she said, "Just someone who's not easily impressed." The bikers were silent again, the tension in the air palpable. They had come here looking for a bit of fun, maybe to scare someone and feel powerful. But this woman had turned the tables on them, and they weren't sure how to handle it. The leader opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the woman spoke again. "Look," she said, her tone softer now, almost sympathetic. "I get it. You're trying to prove something. But trust me, there are better ways to do it than trying to scare people on the street." The bikers looked at each other, their bravado fading. They had expected her to be afraid, to maybe even cry or beg. But instead, she was talking to them like they were the ones who needed help. It was a strange feeling, one they weren't used to. The woman took a step closer to the leader, her eyes locking with his. "You don't have to be the tough guy all the time," she said quietly. "Sometimes, it's okay to just be yourself." The leader stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but then he just shook his head and put his helmet back on. He revved his engine one last time, but it lacked the earlier intensity. Without another word, he signaled to his friends, and they rode off, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. The woman watched them go, a small smile playing on her lips. She shook her head slightly, as if amused by the whole encounter, and then continued walking down the road, her hands back in her pockets. The sun had almost set now, the sky a deep shade of purple. The street was quiet again, the only sound the soft crunch of her footsteps on the gravel. As she walked, she couldn't help but think about the bikers. They had tried to scare her, to make her feel small. But in the end, it was they who had been left stunned. She knew that people often acted out of fear or insecurity, and sometimes, all it took was a little kindness to break through that tough exterior. She didn't know if her words had made a difference, but she hoped that maybe, just maybe, they had given the bikers something to think about. The night was falling fast now, and the woman quickened her pace, eager to get home. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just for the bikers, but for her as well. She had faced them without fear, and in doing so, she had reminded herself of her own strength. It was a small victory, but one that she would carry with her for a long time. The woman walked for another 10 minutes, the cool evening air brushing against her face. The encounter with the bikers lingered in her mind, but she didn't dwell on it too much. She had learned over the years that people often acted out of their own insecurities, and it wasn't her job to fix them. Still, she couldn't help but wonder if her words had made any impact. Shaking her head, she focused on the road ahead, her footsteps steady and deliberate. Meanwhile, the bikers had ridden a few miles down the road before pulling over at a small diner. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting a warm glow on the parking lot. They parked their bikes in a row, the engine sputtering to a stop. The leader, still visibly unsettled, took off his helmet and ran a hand through his hair. His friends followed suit, their earlier bravado replaced by a quiet unease. "What was that about?" one of the bikers asked, breaking the silence. He was the youngest of the group, his face still holding traces of boyishness despite the tough exterior he tried to project. She wasn't scared at all. Not even a little. The leader didn't answer right away. He leaned against his bike, staring at the ground as if it held the answers to his questions. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice low. She was different. The others nodded in agreement, though none of them could quite put their finger on what had made the woman so unshakable. They had expected fear, maybe even anger, but her calm demeanor had thrown them off completely. It wasn't just that she hadn't been scared, it was the way she had looked at them, as if she could see right through their tough guy act. "Maybe she's just crazy," another biker suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. He was trying to make light of the situation, but the encounter had clearly left a mark on all of them. The leader shook his head. No, she wasn't crazy. She was confident. Like she's been through worse and came out stronger. He paused, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of it. I don't know. It's like she saw us for who we really are, not who we pretend to be. The group fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. The diner's door opened, and the smell of greasy food wafted out, but none of them made a move to go inside. They were too caught up in what had just happened, the encounter replaying in their minds like a scene from a movie. Back on the road, the woman had reached her destination, a small, cozy house tucked away at the end of a quiet street. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar warmth of home wrapping around her like a blanket. She kicked off her shoes and hung her jacket on the hook by the door, her movements slow and deliberate. The house was modest but well kept, with soft lighting and a few personal touches that made it feel lived in. She walked into the kitchen and filled a glass with water, taking a long sip before setting it down on the counter. Leaning against the counter, she let out a deep breath, her mind drifting back to the bikers. She wondered if they were still thinking about her, if her words had planted a seed of doubt in their minds. She hoped so. People like them, she knew, often acted out of a place of pain or fear. If she had managed to make them question their actions, even for a moment, then it was worth it. The woman's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the counter. She picked it up and saw a message from a friend, asking how her day had been. She smiled and typed out a quick reply, keeping the details vague. Some things, she thought, were better left unsaid. As she put her phone down, her eyes fell on a photograph on the wall. It was a picture of her from a few years ago, standing on a mountain peak, her arms raised in triumph. She had climbed that mountain alone, pushing herself to the limit and proving to herself that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. The memory brought a smile to her face, a reminder of how far she had come. The woman turned away from the photograph and walked into the living room, where she settled into her favorite chair. She picked up a book from the side table, but her mind was still elsewhere. The encounter with the bikers had stirred something in her, a reminder of the strength she carried within herself. It wasn't just about standing up to them, it was about knowing who she was and refusing to let anyone shake that. As she opened the book, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter what challenges came her way, she would face them with the same calm confidence she had shown tonight. She had been through enough in her life to know that fear was just an illusion, one that could be overcome with the right mindset. Outside, the night was quiet, the stars shining brightly in the sky. The woman's house was a small beacon of light in the darkness, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there was always a way forward. And as she lost herself in the pages of her book, she knew that whatever tomorrow brought, she would be ready. The next morning, the woman woke up early, the first rays of sunlight streaming through her curtains. She stretched and got out of bed, feeling a sense of calm determination. The events of the previous evening were still fresh in her mind, but they no longer weighed on her. Instead, they served as a reminder of her own strength and resilience. She went about her morning routine with a quiet focus, making herself a cup of tea and sitting by the window to watch the world wake up. As she sipped her tea, her thoughts drifted back to the bikers. She wondered if they had thought about her after their encounter, if her words had lingered in their minds the way they had in hers. She didn't expect them to change overnight, but she hoped that maybe, just maybe, she had given them something to think about. People often acted out of habit, she knew, but sometimes all it took was a small nudge to break that cycle. Meanwhile, the bikers were gathered at their usual hangout spot, a rundown garage on the outskirts of town. The leader was tinkering with his bike, his hands moving mechanically as his mind replayed the previous night's events. His friends were scattered around the garage, some working on their bikes, others just lounging around. The atmosphere was quieter than usual, the usual banter replaced by a thoughtful silence. "You're still thinking about her, aren't you?" one of the bikers asked, breaking the silence. He was leaning against a workbench, his arms crossed over his chest. His tone was casual, but there was a hint of curiosity in his voice. The leader didn't look up from his bike. "Yeah," he admitted after a moment. "I can't figure her out. She wasn't scared, not even a little. It's like she's been through hell and came out stronger." The other biker nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe she has," he said. "People like that, they don't just happen. Something made her that way." The leader finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he considered the idea. He had always prided himself on being tough, on not letting anyone get under his skin. But this woman had done just that, and it was bothering him more than he cared to admit. "What do you think she meant?" he asked, his voice low. "About not having to be the tough guy all the time?" The other biker shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe she was trying to say that we don't have to act so hard all the time. That it's okay to just be ourselves." The leader frowned, his mind racing. He had spent so long building up this tough exterior, this persona that kept people at arm's length. The idea of letting that go, even for a moment, was unsettling. But at the same time, there was a part of him that wondered if she was right. If maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep up the act all the time. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a bike pulling into the garage. The youngest member of the group, the one who had spoken up the night before, hopped off his bike and walked over to them. "Hey," he said, his tone hesitant. "I've been thinking about what happened last night. Do you think we were wrong to try and scare her?" The leader and the other biker exchanged glances, neither of them sure how to answer. They had always prided themselves on being tough, on not backing down from a challenge. But this woman had challenged them in a way they hadn't expected, and it had left them questioning everything. "I don't know," the leader finally said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "Maybe we were. Maybe we've been going about this all wrong." The garage fell silent again, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. For the first time in a long time, the bikers were forced to confront the possibility that their tough guy act might not be as foolproof as they had thought. And as they sat there, each lost in their own thoughts, they couldn't help but wonder if the woman had been right all along. The woman spent her morning running errands, moving through the town with her usual quiet efficiency. She stopped by the grocery store, picked up a few things from the pharmacy, and even treated herself to a coffee from her favorite cafe. As she walked, she noticed the world around her with a renewed sense of clarity. The encounter with the bikers had reminded her of something important, that she was stronger than she sometimes gave herself credit for. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way, but one that had stayed with her through the years. As she walked back to her house, she passed by the diner where the bikers had stopped the night before. She glanced inside, half expecting to see them there, but the place was empty except for a few regulars. She smiled to herself and kept walking, her mind drifting back to the conversation she had overheard between two elderly women at the pharmacy. They had been talking about how people often hide their true selves behind masks, afraid of being judged or rejected. It was a sentiment she understood all too well. When she got home, she put away her groceries and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She pulled out a notebook and began to write, something she hadn't done in a long time. The words flowed easily, as if they had been waiting for her to finally put them down on paper. She wrote about the bikers, about the encounter that had left them stunned, and about the quiet strength she had found within herself. It wasn't just a recounting of events, it was a reflection on the masks people wear and the courage it takes to let them go. Meanwhile, the bikers were still at the garage, the atmosphere heavier than usual. The leader had been quiet all morning, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the previous night's events. He had always prided himself on being tough, on not letting anyone get under his skin. But this woman had done just that, and it was bothering him more than he cared to admit. "You're still thinking about her, aren't you?" one of the bikers asked, breaking the silence. He was leaning against a workbench, his arms crossed over his chest. His tone was casual, but there was a hint of curiosity in his voice. The leader didn't look up from his bike. "Yeah," he admitted after a moment. "I can't figure her out. She wasn't scared, not even a little. It's like she's been through hell and came out stronger." The other biker nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe she has," he said. "People like that, they don't just happen. Something made her that way." The leader finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he considered the idea. He had always prided himself on being tough, on not letting anyone get under his skin. But this woman had done just that, and it was bothering him more than he cared to admit. "What do you think she meant?" he asked, his voice low. "About not having to be the tough guy all the time?" The other biker shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe she was trying to say that we don't have to act so hard all the time. That it's okay to just be ourselves." The leader frowned, his mind racing. He had spent so long building up this tough exterior, this persona that kept people at arm's length. The idea of letting that go, even for a moment, was unsettling. But at the same time, there was a part of him that wondered if she was right. If maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep up the act all the time. The woman spent the rest of her day in quiet reflection. After finishing her writing, she decided to take a walk through the nearby park, a place she often went to clear her mind. The park was peaceful, with tall trees swaying gently in the breeze and the sound of birds chirping in the distance. As she walked, she thought about the bikers and the masks people wear to protect themselves. She wondered if they would ever take off theirs, or if they would continue to hide behind their tough exteriors. She sat down on a bench near a small pond, watching the ducks glide across the water. The simplicity of the scene brought her a sense of calm. She thought about her own journey, the struggles she had faced, and how she had learned to embrace her true self. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She hoped that the bikers, and others like them, would one day find the courage to do the same. As she sat there, a young boy approached her, holding a small toy boat. He looked up at her with wide eyes and asked, "Can you help me put my boat in the water?" She smiled and nodded, helping him gently place the boat on the surface of the pond. The boy's face lit up with joy as the boat floated away, and the woman felt a warmth in her heart. It was a small moment, but it reminded her of the importance of kindness and connection. Meanwhile, back at the garage, the bikers were still grappling with their thoughts. The leader had finally put down his tools and was sitting on a stool, staring at the floor. The others were scattered around, some working on their bikes, others just sitting quietly. The usual banter and laughter were absent, replaced by a heavy silence. "You know," the youngest biker said, breaking the silence, "maybe she was right. Maybe we don't have to act so tough all the time." The leader looked up, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. The young biker shrugged. "I don't know. It's just, we're always trying to prove something, you know? Like we have to be the toughest guys around. But what if we don't? What if we're just ourselves?" The leader didn't respond right away. He looked around at his friends, seeing the same uncertainty in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. He had always thought that being tough was the only way to survive, the only way to earn respect. But the woman's words had planted a seed of doubt, and it was starting to grow. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we don't have to prove anything to anyone." The garage fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For the first time in a long time, the bikers were forced to confront the possibility that their tough guy act might not be as foolproof as they had thought. And as they sat there, each lost in their own thoughts, they couldn't help but wonder if the woman had been right all along. The woman, meanwhile, had left the park and was walking back to her house. As she walked, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew that she couldn't change the world, but she could make a difference, even if it was just in small ways. And as she reached her front door, she made a silent promise to herself to continue living authentically, to be true to herself no matter what challenges came her way. The day was coming to an end, the sun dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The woman stood on her porch, watching the colors fade into darkness. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. And as she stepped inside, she felt a quiet confidence settle over her, a reminder of the power of being true to oneself. The next morning, the woman woke up feeling refreshed. The previous day's reflections had left her with a renewed sense of purpose. She decided to spend the day doing things she loved, things that made her feel alive and connected to the world. She started by baking a batch of cookies, the smell of vanilla and chocolate filling her small kitchen. As she worked, she hummed a tune, her movements relaxed and unhurried. It was a simple joy, but one that brought her immense satisfaction. Later, she took her cookies to a nearby community center where she sometimes volunteered. The center was a place where people from all walks of life came together, some seeking help, others offering it. She handed out the cookies to the children, who greeted her with bright smiles and eager hands. The woman felt a deep sense of fulfillment as she watched them enjoy the treats. It was moments like these that reminded her of the importance of giving, of connecting with others in meaningful ways. As she was leaving the center, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance. It was one of the bikers from the other night, the youngest one. He looked out of place, his leather jacket and tough demeanor contrasting sharply with the warm, welcoming atmosphere of the center. He seemed hesitant, as if unsure whether to go in or turn around and leave. The woman approached him, her expression calm and open. "Hey," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "What brings you here?" The biker looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected to see her, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. I don't know," he stammered, his tough exterior cracking just a little. "I was just walking by." The woman nodded, sensing his discomfort. "It's a good place," she said, gesturing to the center. "Lots of good people here. If you ever need anything, they're happy to help." The biker glanced at the building, then back at her. "I don't think I belong here," he said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Why not?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. "Everyone belongs here. It's a place for people, not labels." He didn't respond right away, his eyes dropping to the ground. The woman could see the conflict in his expression, the struggle between the persona he had built and the person he might truly be. She didn't push him, knowing that change had to come from within. Instead, she simply said, "The door's always open if you change your mind." With that, she gave him a small smile and walked away, leaving him standing there, lost in thought. She didn't look back, but she hoped that her words had reached him, even just a little. Meanwhile, back at the garage, the other bikers were going about their usual routine, but the atmosphere was different. The leader was quieter than usual, his mind still wrestling with the thoughts that had been stirred up by the woman's words. He had always believed that being tough was the only way to survive, but now he wasn't so sure. "You okay, man?" one of the bikers asked, noticing his friend's distant expression. The leader shrugged. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've just been thinking about what she said. About not having to be the tough guy all the time." The other biker nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. It's different, you know? But maybe it's not a bad thing." The leader didn't respond, but the seed of doubt had taken root. For the first time in a long time, he was starting to question the persona he had built, the mask he had worn for so long. And as he sat there, surrounded by his friends, he couldn't help but wonder if it was time to let it go. The woman, meanwhile, had returned home, her heart feeling lighter. She didn't know if her words had made a difference, but she hoped that they had planted a seed. Change was a slow process, but every small step counted. And as she sat down with a cup of tea, she felt a quiet sense of hope for the future. The woman spent the rest of her afternoon in quiet contentment. She tidied up her home, watered her plants, and even took some time to read a book she had been meaning to get to. The encounter with the young biker at the community center lingered in her mind, but she didn't dwell on it too much. She had learned over the years that you couldn't force change on people, it had to come from within. All she could do was plant the seed and hope it would grow. As the sun began to set, she decided to take another walk, this time through the quieter streets of her neighborhood. The air was cool, and the streets were bathed in the soft golden light of the evening. She walked slowly, taking in the sights and sounds around her. It was moments like these that reminded her of the beauty in simplicity, in just being present. Meanwhile, the young biker had returned to the garage, his mind racing. He hadn't gone into the community center, but the woman's words had stuck with him. He had always thought of himself as tough, as someone who didn't need help or connection. But standing there, outside the center, he had felt something shift inside him. It was a small crack in the armor he had built around himself, but it was enough to make him question everything. When he walked into the garage, the other bikers noticed the change in him immediately. He was quieter, more thoughtful, and his usual bravado was noticeably absent. The leader, who had been sitting on a stool and staring at the floor, looked up as the young biker approached. "You okay?" the leader asked, his tone softer than usual. The young biker shrugged. "I don't know," he admitted. "I saw her again. The woman from the other night." The leader's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything. He just waited, giving his friend the space to continue. "She was at that community center," the young biker said, his voice low. "She was handing out cookies to kids, smiling, talking to people. She seemed so, I don't know, at peace." The garage fell silent, the other bikers listening intently. They had all been thinking about the woman, about the way she had stood up to them without fear or anger. And now, hearing about her kindness, it only added to the mystery. "What did she say to you?" the leader asked after a moment. The young biker hesitated, then said, "She told me that everyone belongs there. That it's a place for people, not labels." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a long time, none of the bikers spoke. They were all grappling with the same question: had they been hiding behind their labels, their tough exteriors, for so long that they had forgotten who they really were? Finally, the leader broke the silence. "Maybe she's right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe we don't have to be the tough guys all the time. Maybe it's okay to just be ourselves." The other bikers nodded slowly, the idea settling over them like a blanket. It was a strange feeling, one they weren't used to, but it wasn't entirely unwelcome. For the first time in a long time, they were starting to question the masks they had worn for so long. The woman, meanwhile, had returned home, her heart feeling lighter. She didn't know if her words had made a difference, but she hoped that they had planted a seed. Change was a slow process, but every small step counted. And as she sat down with a cup of tea, she felt a quiet sense of hope for the future. The next few days passed quietly for the woman. She went about her routine, finding joy in the small, everyday moments: baking, reading, walking, and volunteering at the community center. She didn't see the bikers again, but she often thought about them, wondering if her words had made any impact. She knew change didn't happen overnight, but she hoped that somewhere, deep down, they were beginning to question the masks they wore. One evening, as she was leaving the community center after helping with a children's art class, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance. It was the leader of the bikers. He looked different this time, less intimidating, more uncertain. His leather jacket was still there, but his posture was less rigid, his expression softer. He was holding a small paper bag in his hands, and when he saw her, he hesitated before stepping forward. "Hey," he said, his voice low but not unkind. I, I brought something for you. The woman raised an eyebrow, surprised but not alarmed. She walked closer, her expression open and curious. For me? She asked, glancing at the bag. He nodded, holding it out to her. It's not much, he said, almost apologetically. Just something to say thanks, I guess. She took the bag and peeked inside. It was a small, handmade bracelet, woven from leather and beads. It was simple but clearly made with care. She looked up at him, her eyes softening. Did you make this? She asked. He shrugged, looking away as if embarrassed. Yeah. I used to make stuff like this when I was younger. Thought I'd try it again. The woman smiled, touched by the gesture. It's beautiful, she said sincerely. Thank you. He nodded again, still avoiding her gaze. I've been thinking, he said after a moment, his voice quieter now. About what you said. About not having to be the tough guy all the time. She didn't say anything, just waited for him to continue. It's hard, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I've been this way for so long, I don't even know who I am without it. The woman's expression softened further, and she took a step closer to him. It's okay to not have all the answers, she said gently. Change doesn't happen overnight. But the fact that you're thinking about it, that's a start. He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find some kind of reassurance. What if I can't do it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if I'm not strong enough? She shook her head. You're stronger than you think, she said firmly. It takes courage to even question who you are. And you're doing that. That's not weakness, that's strength. He didn't respond right away, but she could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between the person he had been and the person he might become. Finally, he nodded, as if accepting her words, even if he didn't fully believe them yet. Thank you, he said quietly. For everything. She smiled again, her warmth genuine. You're welcome, she said. And if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. He nodded again, then turned and walked away, his steps slower and more deliberate than usual. The woman watched him go, a quiet sense of hope settling over her. She didn't know what the future held for him or the other bikers, but she knew that every small step toward change mattered. As she walked home, she slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, admiring the craftsmanship. It was a simple gift, but it carried a deeper meaning, a symbol of connection, of someone beginning to let down their guard. She felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that her words and actions had made a difference, even if it was just a small one. When she got home, she sat down at her kitchen table, the bracelet still on her wrist. She thought about the bikers, about the masks people wear, and about the courage it takes to let them go. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy for them, but she also knew that they had taken the first step. And that was something to be proud of. As the evening turned to night, the woman sat by her window, watching the stars appear in the sky. She felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that she had played a small part in helping someone find their way. It wasn't about changing the world, it was about making a difference, one person at a time. And as she sat there, the bracelet glinting softly in the moonlight, she knew that she had done just that. The night was quiet, the world outside her window calm and still. But inside, the woman felt a quiet sense of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a chance for change, for growth, for connection. And as she closed her eyes, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey she was on, and for the people she had met along the way. A week had passed since the woman's encounter with the biker leader at the community center. Life had returned to its usual rhythm, but something felt different, subtle, yet undeniable. She noticed it in the way people smiled at her on the street, in the way the air seemed a little lighter, as if the world itself was shifting, even if just a little. She didn't know if it was her imagination, but she liked to think that small acts of kindness had a way of rippling outward, touching lives in ways she might never fully see. One afternoon, as she was walking home from the market, she noticed a group of people gathered near the park. Curious, she walked closer and saw that it was the bikers, but they looked different. They weren't on their bikes, and their leather jackets were nowhere to be seen. Instead, they were helping to set up tables and chairs for a community event. The woman stopped in her tracks, her heart swelling with a mix of surprise and pride. The leader of the group noticed her first. He looked up from the table he was arranging and gave her a small nod, his expression a mix of shyness and determination. She walked over, her smile warm and genuine. "Looks like you're keeping busy," she said, glancing around at the setup. He shrugged, but there was a hint of a smile on his face. "Yeah, well, we thought we'd try something different. The community center needed help with this event, so, here we are." The woman's smile widened. "That's amazing," she said sincerely. "It's good to see you all here." He nodded, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting hers again. "It's different," he admitted. "But it feels, I don't know, good, I guess." She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet pride in doing something meaningful. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "All of you." He looked surprised by her words, but then he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thanks," he said quietly. "That means a lot." The other bikers noticed her then and waved, their expressions friendly and open. The woman waved back, feeling a deep sense of connection. It wasn't just about the event or the help they were providing, it was about the shift in their energy, the way they were beginning to let down their guards and embrace something new. As she walked away, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She didn't know what had prompted the bikers to get involved in the community event, but she liked to think that her words had played a small part. Change was a slow process, but every step counted, and she was grateful to have witnessed this one. That evening, as she sat by her window with a cup of tea, she thought about the journey she had been on, not just the bikers, but her own. She had faced her own struggles, her own moments of doubt and fear, but she had come out stronger on the other side. And now, seeing the bikers take their first steps toward change, she felt a renewed sense of hope for the world. The bracelet he had given her still rested on her wrist, a constant reminder of the power of connection and kindness. She ran her fingers over the beads, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the people she had met and the lessons she had learned along the way. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, the woman felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, for her, for the bikers, or for anyone else. But she also knew that every small act of kindness, every moment of courage, had the power to make a difference. And as she sat there, watching the stars twinkle in the darkness, she made a silent promise to herself, to continue living authentically, to be true to herself, and to always extend a hand of kindness to those who needed it. Because in the end, she knew that it was the small, everyday moments that truly mattered, the moments of connection, of growth, of hope. The night was quiet, the world outside her window calm and still. But inside, the woman felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey she was on, and for the people she had met along the way. And as she closed her eyes, she knew that whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with the same quiet strength and unwavering hope that had carried her this far.